As always, I like to start off with the graphic that Dr. Dan Kopp, the previous uh, um, commissioner for global education at the IBOE, he would always present this, and somehow he inserted these two. Now, these are the usual standard icons for male and female. And because our church supports women in clergy, there was an icon with just a male figure represented. And I feel that it's important to say in Africa, we really value both women and men in clergy. And I'll share with you just a little bit later how wonderful we have so many who are so committed to the ministry, but they're at the center of all that we're talking about today. Both our men and women are not limited to age or demographic or ethnicity, but that we are the people of God's kingdom, and that we have embraced that His will is being done in our world. And so the involvement and the support of these, the student who is studying to be clergy, and seldom would you find me using the word, very restrictively. I'm not just talking about clergy. I'm talking about Christian leader development on the continent, because some are leading in areas of their legal practices. Others are leading in areas of their business practice. Some are clergy. Some are full-time evangelists. Others, and so you get the picture. So as I go through this presentation quickly, I'll talk a little bit about the Genesis and the advancement of that, Nazarene Library Network, thanks to obviously Sharon and her impartation and input there. We'll talk a little bit about Turnitin, which is a need for the now. I'll share with you Faten, and then I'll talk about the clergy gap, and then the Nazarene education clergy development in Africa, and then we'll talk about the numbers. Regarding Genesis, somewhere in those documents that I've shared, you will find us identifying. By the way, let me just make a quick comment about the documents. What you're reading is an April digest that I send to my regional director, Dr. Danny Gomez, who, by the way, also sends his compliments and greetings to you as a team working with us in Africa. So I share that digest with him, but this is a little bit more of a comprehensive sharing on this PowerPoint. When we talk about Genesis, we're talking about the global consortium and that initiative to have our student information systems brought together, in some way standardized. In the past, we've had different fields keeping different student information, and it was not always well taken care of. Now we have a system made possible by IBOE so that we're able to get all of our information onto central databases and keep that. SANU was the first, in fact, I think, of all our 52 institutions. SANU, through Professor Winnie, had requested a system like this. And so in some ways, she gave generation to that. She oriented us to thinking in that regard. NTC South Africa has taken full deployment, by the way, of their system, and they're currently working with it. And from what I've heard, it's working fairly well. ANU is in the process, African Nazarene University. They're working, because it's a huge institution, they're working out some of the minor details. And I'm in the hope that Nazarene Bible College, East Africa, and ITN is also being incorporated into the system. Now, let me tell you about ITN. ITN is the same as Nazarene Theological Institute. ITN is the French version, and both of them we do function with the Anglo and the Francophone in West Africa, moving right up until Central Africa and even to some parts on the eastern fields. So ITN serves almost 16 different nationalities, 16 different countries, a variety of ethnicities, and I'll show you the numbers a little later on. We are training clergy, primarily we are training clergy in those schools across these various nations. And so you would imagine that a student information system, keeping track of those who are ready for ordination, those who have finished their courses, not everybody finishes in block. So there's a necessity. And recently we had a glitch in the system, but because of our team at Global, they were able to help us through the Genexus. Library network, obviously, it used to be called Mission Nazarene Libraries. I just want to say a few things on this one. Because of this partnership, and it's a critical partnership, we are really longing to see some things develop apart from just a repository format. And I'm connecting this because I didn't have any other place to connect this. My excitement and enthusiasm is for developing African writers so that we can have more material written from the North, the East, the South, pertaining to Wesleyan theological studies. Let me tell you why that's important. Africa, for the longest time, historically, has had most of the mission work in Africa was embedded within Reformed theology. It gave rise to systems that were, in many cases, very harsh. And so as we work towards producing theological thinkers in the Wesleyan tradition, I think this is critical for us. Recently, as we worked with the network of Southern African schools, higher education Christian schools, private higher education schools, one thing stood out for us was that we don't have the numbers in terms of writers, African writers writing in the Wesleyan tradition. So when I talk about library, I also want to push that a little bit more to say we need publication. We need stimulation from our academic deans across our 9 schools in Africa. And so I've covered some of that. Our universities are producing many dissertations through the year. We need those dissertations captured. We need them as part of our libraries. If we can publish them and put them also in some format, printed format, if we can release them into digital format, that's building the African resource from a Wesleyan perspective. And so we would also love to work with our global libraries. We've tried that in the past. Somehow we've not ironed out all the glitches, and you can ask me about the glitches a little later on. But I think this is something that we should be working towards, is connecting our sister libraries from all of our institutions into one format where we can have access to all of these wonderful works that we produce. And then creating digital libraries. In some countries, the internet is not easily accessible. In some countries, the internet is switched off. And so we would need fixed digital libraries that can be shared through an Ethernet, intranet. We can put them on flash drives and pass those on to some of our clergy as they develop in fixed formats. I want to talk a little bit about Turnitin. Plagiarism has been an issue for me within the African context in terms of academic work. In the sense, not that we have people simply copying and pasting, no. What we have are people who are working diligently, creating new ideas, fresh ideas. And because of the majority of our cultures being oral by tradition, those ideas are not documented. And so they float around quite freely. And people who believe I own that work write about it or at some point publish that. But by then, the novelty has already spread. And so there's a matrix of issues. In our schools, we do have issues of plagiarism. And I think we need to curb that. We need to find ways of doing that. You can really, as you help us in terms of finding the tools, the instruments to curb that. So the comment I wanted to make is in helping our African theologians and practitioners produce original thought ideas and literature, we are working to equip every school to offer students the instrument that will test their work and that they're able to submit the same with great confidence and accuracy. I think that would just sum it up for me. FATEN is the French school that we are busy working with currently. Dr. Gomez has really put his weight behind this because in Africa, it has been said, I think during the time of Dr. John Siemens in the West African fields, the idea was that the need, he was quoted as being said, the need speaks French. And I see that. I see that we have not taken the time to really develop an academic program. And so FATEN is now our current online college that will offer a bachelor's degree in French. And once again, we need writers who are writing Wesleyan material from our perspectives that have solid credibility, soundness in their delivery, and are well published, and that we can be able to present that with confidence. And so we're working with this. Several of our partners have been formed into various committees, and we're currently just working through now the documents, the source documents that will inform the comprising of this school. The clergy gap, when I talk about the clergy gap, let me just take you quickly through this graphic. The Church of the Nazarene, we went back about 20 or 30 years, about 3 decades, and we explored the design of clergy development in Africa. Let me say, if you look here, we have 4,350 clergy ordained and licensed. And they serve a total number of 8,177. Immediately, you can see the gap that is developed. And so when we talk about the clergy gap, we are talking not so much in the South. As you can see, we have 872 licensed and ordained ministers, and we have 911 active churches in the Southern Africa fields. We're not so concerned about how that develops. Our concern is here in the West African Anglophone, Francophone countries. We're looking at in the East African and the Central. If you look at the discrepancies in terms of the way in which the numbers add up, we are desperately trying to educate and to push so that we'll be able to say we have far more churches being planted than we can shape and raise Christian leaders in these fields. When I had a conversation, we called together a group of people that represent all of these different fields, and we asked them, why do you think we have this clergy gap? What are the causes for this disparity in the numbers? One was that there are delays in ordination because courses in these schools are not offered regularly, so people don't get to finish their course of study. Number 2, ordinations are delayed as records have not been up to date. And thankfully, through the Genexus program, we're now able to create and sustain those databases. But that's very new. That's not been an old fixture. That's just a new addition. And so until we are able to do that sufficiently, many students have not had their data up to date, administratively speaking. In terms of the requirements, somehow the goalposts move because we've had situations where in some countries, people were given the green light to say you can go ahead and pursue a 24-month degree. Obviously, for those of you who work with the ICOSAC, the International Course of Study Administration, that advisory committee, you would know that we don't work on a 24-month course of study. We work on a 36-month course of study. And so while certain countries say you can do a 24-month diploma, we have a regulation that says, no, you have to finish a 3-year diploma. And so those areas that are ambiguous, whether it's a national framework or the church's stipulation, we need to fit those together and work through those. Then there's issues of integrity. We talked about what is required from our trainees, what is required from our developing clergy, what is done, what is being reported. We talked about the limitations of technology and library resources. And then that last part that I'm really passionate about is that we don't do well. And I'm not just talking about Africa. I'm talking about across the globe within our educational systems. We don't do well to measure our projected outcomes. We'd like to see clergy have a set of outcomes when they finish their course of study programs. But what we don't do well is we don't measure that. And the best way to do that is to pair all trainee clergy with capable and willing mentors. And that's a whole conversation by itself. And so those are some of the possible responses. We're talking about administration, understanding and explaining the requirements, et cetera, et cetera. On my side, we are talking about Nazarene education and clergy development on the continent, and I use the acronym TREE, that's for teacher development. We want to be able to support scholarships. Let me tell you what's troubling me. In the next 5 years, many of our older practitioners and theologians will retire from most of our schools. We will have a deficit of teachers. We cannot go and recruit unless we are training African leaders from within their frameworks to bring about African solutions. And so we're not doing that fast enough. And that's a challenge to us, that masters and PhDs, we don't have the resources to present as many of our willing clergy. We have bright minds, young clergy who would love to go on and study. But the challenge is that we aren't able to offer those kinds of scholarships. So teacher development is an issue for us. Resourcing education and clergy development, I just mentioned this. I'm so grateful for the 12,000 Rand matching grant that has been made possible. And yet, when we think about it, the challenge is not simply the development of academic minds. We also want to develop mentoring programs, which in itself become costly in terms of travel, communication. And so the needs begin to add up. Mentoring partnerships, I see this as our non-formal educational system. We have to have pastors who are being mentored and given at least some supervision before we release them into senior leadership across the continent. We have to find ways of developing them in some ways through an internship program. And let me give you an example. You will not get onto an aeroplane if you had the pilot who had not met a certain number of hours, because life is vital and you want to keep body and spirit together as long as possible. The way in which we do clergy development often is that a person comes through a school, they get their course of study, barely any mentorship, no formal internship. It's a requirement, but it's not often measured. And then we release them to take on a big church. We're setting people up for failure. And so we do need to find ways of resourcing, but also resourcing clergy in terms of co-vocationality. You don't just have to work in the church. You can be resourced to be a teacher, an economist, and come back into the church. And so we want to be able to train and equip them in those levels. Empowerment and engagement in education. Again, I'm talking about the Francophone and Lusophone developments. Those are pockets, huge pockets. Almost 2/3 of our membership are in those pockets. We need to find ways of empowering and engaging their development of their schools and their programs. And then establishing a regional network, the ongoing institutional work. In other words, our schools don't often work well together, although we have a system called ANESA. Because of the busyness, and recently in COVID times, That's not been working well, and we're trying to find ways to establish those connectivities. Here's the numbers. If you're interested in how we're developing, African Nazarene University, Dr. Scott, you asked me for these numbers, so I thought I'll just provide them very briefly. African Nazarene University, you'll see all of the numbers will reflect these KPIs. At least our ministerial students, our Nazarene pastorals, our alumni, and etc. Our enrollment at African Nazarene University, 2,505. Currently, because of the COVID, we used to stand just around the 4,000 mark pre-COVID. Nazarene Bible College of East Africa, you'll see this is a huge number. Again, this is not necessarily a brick and mortar school. Sorry, if I just take you back, you'll see African Nazarene University only has 2 educational centers. But whereas if you look at NBCEA, you'll see that we have 36 centers, and these are centers more set within communities. Brother Tom, you raised a comment, and I think this also goes to that point, that if we don't measure well what's taking place in the localities with these educational centers, we don't have a well-produced handbook on internship and supervised ministry, what we'll have is a very unstandardized, perhaps even a very dangerously weak, anemic system of clergy who have developed in the system, but may not be good in the practice or the application thereof. NTC South Africa, again, you'll see that they currently have a larger online number. NTC Central Africa, 478 in their total enrollment. And they have 31 as alumni that have been assigned. The institution in the West and Central, 1,218 total enrollment, and the rest of the figures speak for themselves. The seminary in Cape Verde, 41, and again, this is a very small group in the seminary, but a very diligent group and growing. Those numbers are actually improved numbers. And this is the seminary in Mozambique. Current enrollment standing at around 1,017, and they have 88 education centers. Once again, our need is to train the clergy who teach in those centers and to move them beyond diplomas to at least degrees and masters and PhDs and create that pool of academics for Africa. 2,201 at SANU, and this is a limited number, obviously due to the COVID. The universities, as you see, they don't usually have education centers. And my conversation now with the deans currently as to why that is happening. CLI, this is not an IBOE registered school. We are working currently to register the school, but they are doing an amazing work in East and the Horn of Africa. That's our total enrollment. And I have a question when you talk with me, at least at some point in the future. Help me understand what you understand when we say clergy development, because this is such a huge word, and I find so many people have so many different expectations, and we tend to be talking different languages. So when you say clergy development, I'm really curious, what do you mean when you say that? Thank you for allowing me to speak to these issues.